Well, hello and welcome to the audio commentary, one of several audio commentaries on this beautiful new special edition of William Lustig's Vigilante. My name is Troy Howarth. I'm a writer who tends to specialize in European cult cinema, but I'm also a sucker for gritty 1970s, 80s era New York set police thrillers and vigilante movies. And of course, this is a very fine example of that particular genre. Very happy to be joined today by
Nathaniel Thompson from Mondo Digital. And yes, I like this one too. It's a really fun film, and I think it could always stand to have a new commentary track. There's lots to say. So it's been quite a few years since the last one, so I've got some catching up to do.
Very true. And of course, here we have the great Fred Williamson, the very imposing Fred Williamson. And this guy in the hat here kind of makes me think if it were made today, the whole hat would be red, but we won't go there. But Fred Williamson gets this movie off to a rousing beginning, obviously. He has some great speeches in this movie, some really stirring stuff that he has to do. Throughout the film, he's kind of the incendiary figure in this film that's all about martial law and vigilantism and so forth. He's the perfect guy for this particular character.
Indeed, he is. And by the way, the very first shot of this film, you might have seen the credit for Magnum. That was the very short-lived theatrical branch of director William Lustig's own company. It's probably better known if you're of a certain age and a big VHS horror hound. That morphed into Magnum Entertainment, which brought us a lot of great titles on VHS and Laserdisc back in the days. They were the very first company that released Suspiria on American home video, along with stuff like The Wicker Man and Vampires, Witchboard, Boogeyman, Haunting of Julia, all that kind of stuff. Although their biggest continuing one is probably Zombie, Lucio Fulci classic, which Lustig still retains under the current Blue Underground header. So in a way, Magnum, which you saw here, is basically what turned into Blue Underground that we have now. That's the short version of it anyway.
Yeah, that's very true. And of course, Lustig is a major devotee of Italian horror films, and he was very much responsible for bringing a lot of the great horror films and Polizio films and Giallo films to American shores in the late 90s and early 2000s. He was responsible for, as you said, the release of Suspiria, which was a really highly requested movie on home video. There was a poll at one point, I believe, where it was the most requested title on home video for many years. So, yeah, I mean, he's definitely very much indebted to these films and has always tried to sort of pay it back. He actually even had a kind of production role on Dario Argento's Inferno, which was shot in, at least partially, in New York City in 1979. So there's some crossovers there with Dario Argento. As a matter of fact, there's even some helicopter shots from that were shot for Inferno that Argento decided not to use because he thought they were a little too shaky or whatnot. And Lustig was able to get access to them, and you can actually see them in Maniac, I believe.
By the way, this music you're hearing over the opening titles, this is the second score by Jay Chataway, who of course had made his debut with Maniac, which is a very fine electronic score, kind of in the Halloween mold. There's a bit of a John Carpenter in the way that he uses those electronic stingers in both that film and this one. You get some really fun little Chataway like noises scattered through here, but I like his work a lot. I think it's kind of tragic that we've never had a soundtrack release for this film. I don't know if it's an issue with the masters or maybe it's just too short, but hopefully with this reissue maybe we'll get a soundtrack CD at long last, because it has never come out in any format whatsoever. Unfortunately, of course, Chataway went on to do a lot of notable films. He signed it with Cannon, where he did Missing in Action, Invasion USA, worked with Lustig again on Maniac Cop. Of course, one of his best scores from the Hollywood era would be Silver Bullet, the Stephen King adaptation, Red Scorpion. But I think to the public at large, he's probably best known for doing many episodes of the various iterations of Star Trek, including The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, Enterprise, and Voyager. There are tons of CD collections out there of his work. But yeah, really solid composer. But I think this is one of my very favorites. The main theme here that you just heard, I think, is one of his best pieces in general. It's just this great, swanky kind of, it's almost like Ennio Morricone meets John Carpenter kind of vibe to it. It's really great.
Yes, the Morricone aspect is particularly well spotted in the sense that Lustig was openly inspired on this particular film. He was really thinking of the Polizio films, but also the spaghetti westerns. So in many respects, it almost does play out like a western in a urban setting. He said in one of his commentary tracks with his film, in fact, that you can also hear on this release, that this was an opportunity for him to do a kind of Western type film. There wasn't much of an opportunity to do things like this in New York City in the early 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
So put it into an urban setting like this, which really, in many respects, is how the Polizio film kind of evolved anyway, because as the spaghetti Western in the 1960s started to reach that point where you got towards the end of the decade and you started having the Terrence Hill, Bud Spencer sort of parody westerns. Inevitably, you were starting to reach a point where the genre was jumping the shark, so to speak, and then the Polizio films came along and played into that sort of sense of urban paranoia that was very much inspired by all the violence that was taking place in Italy at that time. And of course, these urban thrillers of the late 70s and early 80s, most of them set in New York City, some of them also in Los Angeles, but most of them set in New York City. That really was the place to be in terms of urban blight and urban destruction during this period of time. So this film is very much indebted to that particular kind of subgenre that by the time this movie was made, effectively was dead in Italy. It made perfect sense that Lustig should be influenced by those movies, and if you know those films, you can definitely spot the influence throughout this picture.
Yeah, I mean, the New York location kind of goes hand in hand with the Vigilante thing, probably because it was really fully kicked off, of course, by the big one, of course, being Michael Winter's Death Wish in '74, but also Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver in '76. You know, you can't really separate that New York vibe from them. When you try to do it somewhere else, it just comes off a bit odd. I think one of the weirdest ones being something like a movie called Stand Alone, that Charles Durning was in with Pam Grier in 1985, which is where Charles Durning is the vigilante. And first of all, it's probably one of the more racist examples because it's all Latinos who are drawn as negatively as you can possibly imagine. But it's set in the Midwest, and when you change it to that, it's just really peculiar. It doesn't quite work. You need the grime and the grit and this atmosphere to it to really pull it off, I think.
Wow, it's true. And also, Charles Durning as a kind of action hero is also something to contend with. It has to be said. Yeah, I mean, New York City, certainly during the late 70s, early 80s, I mean, there was so much going on in New York that helped to inspire this rush of vigilante, and not always just vigilante films, but also films about crooked cops. There was a lot of films about corruption and things like that. There was a lot in the press that had a lot to do with what was responsible. Certainly in the early 80s, the big epidemic, the major epidemic was crack.
Yeah.
That was a major thing. But even if you go back to the mid 70s, you had the Son of Sam killings, which began in 76. In September of 77, a very unusual kind of crossover between the real world and the film world happened when the film journalist Addison Verrill was murdered, which kicked off a series of killings of gay men that were committed, body parts showing up in the East River and things like that, turned out to be committed by a man by the name of Paul Bateson, who was a former radiology technician who had appeared in The Exorcist. You can see him in The Exorcist. He plays the tech that helps to administer that really horrible medical test on Reagan at one point, where he sticks the needle into her artery and all the blood comes spurting out. That's Paul Bateson. That's a legitimate serial killer right there, which in turn inspired the movie Cruising, which of course was also directed by William Friedkin, although it originally had been mooted to be directed by, of all people, Steven Spielberg. And then at one point, Brian De Palma was also involved as well. But of course, Friedkin ended up making it. There's a lot of tie-ins and connections actually to Friedkin in this particular film. And we'll talk about some of that, some of the casting and some of the people involved. Friedkin was very much involved in a lot of films that were set in New York, involving with the police, obviously the French Connection being the classic example, but also Cruising, which is a movie that was pretty much loathed and I think terribly misunderstood for many years, that has finally been kind of semi-rehabilitated. I don't know that it will ever be fully embraced, but I think it's quite brilliant myself. But there are definitely some connections between this film and those films as well. So there was this kind of wonderful period of time where you had these really, in many respects, somewhat distasteful films, and some of them were extraordinarily exploitive in a really, really bad way. And other ones were kind of misunderstood or seen as being fascist or seen as being very right-wing, and I'm not always entirely sure that that's entirely true with a lot of them.
Yeah. In fact, one big cruising connection was just a couple of minutes back. The gentleman wearing the scarf is Randy Jurgensen, of course, who was the investigating officer, but he was also involved, of course, in the French Connection. The Seven Ups, I think, being probably one of the more unsung films that he served as an advisor on, which has some wonderful car chases. And of course, Randy also pops up as the stunt driver during the finale, which he got busted on for performing the stunt in blackface, of all things. Yeah, he's credited as the executive producer on this, but he was also just the general technical advisor on various police matters, being a genuine LAPD detective. But there's actually been a documentary about him in the works for a couple of years. I don't know when it's coming out, but I look forward to it. But it's about the one case of his that, quote unquote, got away from him, as well as his film work. So he's a fascinating guy and a really rich history. So if you don't know much about Randy, you might want to look him up. There's some really great stories about him.
Yeah, well, we'll point him out when he comes back. He shows up a few times in the film, of course, and he's definitely recognizable if you've seen some of these films. And of course, he also was the real life inspiration for the character played by Al Pacino in Cruising.
Right.
He was involved in the series of killings that targeted gay men in the late '70s. That was kicked off by the murder of Addison Verrill. So yeah, I mean, he definitely had a very interesting life and a very interesting career, and he's very much a part of this kind of fabric of gritty New York set crime and police films of this particular period.
Yeah. And he's not the only Cruising alumnus that you're going to see in this film, but we'll get to that later on, of course. I don't want to spoil
yes.
it. Don't spoil it.
Yes, yes, we got definitely some crossovers here, but I mean, again, just going back to some of the other kind of horrible things that were in the headlines at that time. In 1978, you had the situation Sid Vicious stabbed his girlfriend Nancy to death. 1978, December of 1978, there was a major heist connected to the mob, which would later inspire films like Goodfellas and so forth. Henry Hill was actually involved in that particular heist. Involved, I think, about $5 million that was stolen. In the early 80s, you had, in March of 1980, there was an ex-congressman named Allard Lowenstein who was shot to death in his office in Manhattan by a former colleague who had serious mental health issues. December of 1980 saw John Lennon being shot to death outside of the Dakota, the apartment building that is immortalized in Rosemary's Baby. It's the exterior of the apartment building in Rosemary's Baby, and of course, in real life, much earlier had been the home of Boris Karloff for a period of time. So, and it wasn't just things like this too, but also, apart from the epidemic with drugs that were running riot on the streets and the various different gang activities and prostitution run wild and all kinds of things that were going on, there was also more and more stories about police brutality which were coming into the press. And of course, here we are in June of 2020, and not much has changed. So this movie is actually rather timely in some respects. Kind of makes you wonder whether or not there'd be some temptation to re-release a film like this if we could go to movie theaters at this time, although they're starting to reopen. So yeah, I mean, there was a lot that was in the air during this time, and it really did trigger this a remarkable run of films, some of which are obviously very revered and very popular. Think of movies like Dirty Harry and Death Wish, of course, you mentioned before, and but also some of the more neglected movies. You mentioned The Seven Ups, of course, is a fantastic film, but of course, during the 80s, Charles Bronson had a wonderful run of kind of not only vigilante films, but police films as well, so he was kind of having the best of both worlds. And we think about movies like 10 Till Midnight and the Death Wish sequels, which in a funny way, the original Death Wish, which was a major box office hit when it came out in 1974, is a much more complex movie than a lot of people give it credit for. I think it's a movie that, isn't nearly as quote-unquote fascist as some people might make it out to be. But the sequels kind of killed goodwill and on a certain level. As much as I love them, Death Wish 2 is arguably the sleaziest film ever produced for a major studio. I mean, it really pushes the boundaries of good taste to an extent that the original cinematographer and his crew quit the film because Michael Winner was going a lot further with certain scenes in that movie than what was on the page, and everybody just had enough and quit. Pretty despicable movie on a certain level, but I got to admit, I dearly love it.
Yeah. On the other hand, I won't say anything negative about Death Wish 3 whatsoever. It's a perfect film.
Oh, it's a masterpiece, of course, and it's a tremendous cartoon. It really is. I mean, if you just take it in the right spirit, my God, it's a lot of fun.
It
So,
is, yeah. Like minute for minute, it's like one of the most entertaining films of the '80s. I don't think you can really top it. It's so much fun.
oh, it is. I think you really have to be, terribly sort of self-serious not to be able to enjoy these movies at all. Fred Williamson, of course, there, dominating the frame as he tends to do by virtue of his sheer size and bulk.
Hmm.
But to his left is Richard Bright, who's another very familiar character actor, of
Hmm.
course, best known for playing Al Neary in the Godfather trilogy, but had done a ton of really interesting films. And actually ended up, in addition to, I mean, he worked for Sam Peckinpah on several films. He's in Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, The Getaway, and Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia.
Hmm.
But he'd also appeared with Britannia Alda, who we haven't talked about yet, but
Hmm.
she'll be coming back into the film in a big way for her big sequence coming up. They had both been in Looking for Mr. Goodbar, which is one of the great sort of downbeat, feel-bad movies of the 70s, which is
Yep.
still mysteriously unavailable on video. And But he also showed up in a couple episodes of one of my favorite shows of the 1980s, and really one of the great gritty New York shows of the period, which was The Equalizer, starring Edward Woodward. And there's other connections to the cast with The Equalizer as well, because of course Fred Williamson is also in a couple episodes of that, as well as Joe Spinell, who's going to pop up later on. So another very familiar and welcome face in this film. There's a lot of familiar faces in this movie.
Hmm. So now, of course, we're getting to one of the film's more infamous sequences right here, which breaks one of the cardinal cinematic rules, which is that you never kill a kid. Of course, this follows in the footsteps, of course, of Assault on Precinct 13 and Andy Warhol's Bad. But of course, Britannia Aldo was no stranger to this, having just been in Amityville 2, which follows a similar line. If you've seen that one, so
Yes.
she was not having very good luck as a character on screen around this period, to put it mildly.
It's true. Well, she did a few genre films around this period of time. She'd been in The Fury for Brian De Palma. She was in a wonderful film called When a Stranger Calls.
Yes.
She'd been in Christmas Evil and Amityville 2, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the only worthwhile film in the Amityville franchise. How precisely Dino De Laurentiis got Damiano Damiani, of all people, to direct that film, I don't know. But it's a wonderful film. The first half, I think, is kind of a masterpiece, but the second half turns into an Exorcist knockoff, but it's still a lot of fun. And she's very good in that, of course, playing the kind of abused wife of Burt Young. And, of course, Burt Young is perfect casting for that particular character in that film. It's the one that really does hew closest to the quote-unquote real story that inspired the whole notorious Amityville possession, haunted house routine that sustained a series of, I don't even know how many films, but certainly Amityville 2 is the gem of the series.
Yeah, I'd say there's ones that I have a certain soft spot for, but Amityville 2 is certainly the most memorable, I think. That first hour in particular is really something to behold. It's very disturbing stuff. Just really quick, since you were talking about police corruption and brutality at the time, this also is an interesting film to compare to something like Magnum Force, which, as much as one likes to sort of slap the fascist label on vigilante films, that one, I had before this, it kind of started the conversation about how you were defining that, because that is about a genuine, like, sort of secret fascist organization of police members who have set up this vigilante team that Dirty Harry actually has to go up against. And so it was a bit of a complicated issue at the time, because people would slap labels like fascist or racist on these films. But I think this Vigilante, this film in particular, does it in a fascinating way, because if you watch the first 40 minutes or so, it seems like it's going that way because the criminals that you see are all either black or Latino, but then it starts to point the finger at the white powers that be, and that's the one that ultimately is held responsible at the end of the film. So I think in a way this film was a bit ahead of its time in showing how that was kind of the really the root of where all this was coming from, because as we later found out, it was very documented that the crack epidemic, for example, had been essentially, engineered by, again, the white powers that be, by higher forces, and that's a whole other subject. You can look it up and read about it, but that really ties into where this film is heading. And then, of course, right after this, about a year after this came out theatrically, it came out in '83, but it was sneaked and shown in some places in '82, but the year after this, of course, was the infamous Bernie Goetz vigilante shooting on the subway in New York, which really started the conversation up all over again. And I'm kind of surprised that there wasn't a big vigilante movie wave after that happened. You would have thought Hollywood would have jumped on it, but it never really quite happened. You had the Death Wish films, which the further you got in, they kind of veered away from the vigilante aspect. It was more just, it was kind of like a Rambo film by that point. So yeah, it is curious that in a way that brought it into the conversation more after this film, but it never really seemed to go anywhere. And by now, of course, you don't really have pure vigilante films at all. You have the, one-offs like that terrible Death Wish remake, or like Death Sentence is a pretty credible one, but it's pretty rare that you get one now So maybe it's due for a revival at some point. Who knows?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny she mentioned the Getz situation because when that happened, Lustig actually toyed with the idea of putting this movie back out in theaters. It had, by way of just a little bit of background on the production, which we're not going to get terribly into. It should be obvious by now. We're not getting terribly screen specific about what's going on for the simple reason that you have the option of listening to William Lustig and his collaborators on 2 separate tracks. And they're going to cover a lot of that, obviously, in better detail than we can. So we're kind of riffing on a variety of different topics as they come up. But in terms of specific production background, this film was given a budget of approximately $2 million, and it shot for about 8 weeks from the 16th of October through the middle of December of 1981. It was intended originally, according to Variety, they said that it was originally supposed to start in September, but it was delayed for reasons that are unknown. It got shown at the Cannes Film Festival in May of 1982, but it didn't really get a proper theatrical release until March of 1983, so a little bit of a lag there. They did obviously run into some censorship woes, and there were some cuts that were initiated, but this version is, of course, fully restored. It has all the splatter intact as intended. You mentioned before the killing of the child in Assault on Precinct 13, which, of course, is still, an incredibly shocking moment, and it's one that even John Carpenter questions whether he was right to do it. He's said in years later, I wouldn't do that today, but back then, he was an ambitious young filmmaker, and he wanted to make his mark, so he did it. I'm personally glad he did, just because it's so incredibly memorable. I mean, nobody will forget this, but the funny thing with that was, of course, by virtue of doing that, of having a child killed on camera like that, the movie was slapped with an X rating, and in order to appease the censors, Carpenter removed the scene from the version that was submitted to the MPAA. They gave it an R rating, and then he snuck it back into the movie, and it went back into release, and it's never been cut. So, I guess he could have landed himself in some hot water over that, but nope, no, indeed not. He snuck it in, and the scene has continued to shock and delight and amaze and horrify people over 40 years later on.
Well, thank God he did, because if you cut that one shot out, the movie would make absolutely no sense. So.
Well, it's very important to the plot. It's not gratuitous, but it's
the whole motivation for what happens. Yeah, if you take it out.
Yeah, it really is. It's a very important sequence, but it's just one of those no-nos, and this is pretty grim as well. I mean, we don't see it in detail, but what we see is enough, and it's certainly this sequence, by the way, always, speaking of John Carpenter, always reminds me, of course, of Halloween with the sheets hanging in Laurie Strode's backyard. Lustig is a film buff, obviously. First and foremost, he's a film buff, so his movies are loaded with little allusions to the movies that he knows and loves, which is, what everybody from Joe Dante to Martin Scorsese and beyond will do. And, that's it's pretty rough when you think about what just happened. But, I guess it's as tasteful as could be under the circumstances.
Well, except the blood splatter, I don't know. But, and you'll also notice that although this whole plot device of the killing of the kid and the near killing of the wife, this is actually very similar to the setup of a film right before this. It's not usually thought of as a vigilante film, although it definitely is, except with the sci-fi angle, which is 1979's Mad Max, George Miller classic, which has a very similar setup to this film. You could actually probably pair them up. It'd be kind of an interesting double feature, as they do overlap quite a bit in terms of narrative.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And, to go into the topic of the sort of vigilante films and the rogue cop films, I guess more specifically, that were very popular during this time, yes, a lot of them were attacked quite heavily by members of the press who saw them as sort of being disgusting and immoral and fascist. Of course, famously Pauline Kael called Dirty Harry fascist. What's interesting is the first sequel to Dirty Harry, Magnum Force, is almost kind of a response to that. Because you have in Magnum Force, you have Dirty Harry going up against a true group of fascists. So it's almost as if, in making the film, which in many respects, I would say the actual script for Magnum Force is in some respects a more layered and more interesting script than the script for the original Dirty Harry, but it unfortunately lacks the clarity of vision of Don Siegel at the helm. So it's not quite as good a film, but as the sequels go, it's certainly the best. But yes, it was almost as if there is this attempt to kind of respond to that and say, well, no, this is real fascism. He's fighting real fascism, as opposed to the first film, which really relies on the idea that the audience is aware and is sympathetic with the fact that ultimately Harry is correct insofar as Scorpio is completely deranged and needs to be dealt with in the harshest possible terms. You get the apotheosis of that at the end of the film when he's literally placing an entire school bus of children in danger. So, how obvious can you be in terms of trying to get the audience on your side? The film, I don't think, really advocates the idea that the police need to be given a free hand to brutalize the suspects and ignore the letter of the law, but it is saying that in certain situations, when you're dealing with really extreme characters like a character like Scorpio, people like Dirty Harry have their place, and I think that's ultimately what the film is saying. Not so much that it's because Siegel, of course, didn't write the film, but Siegel was not a right-leaning person himself. It wasn't that he was trying to impose this kind of political message on the film for the audience to get the impression that the police need to be given the freedom to do whatever the hell they want to do, regardless of the letter of the law. It's just that in a situation like this, and there's Randy Jurgensen, by the way, just to point him out real quick, that whole setup works because we're aware of the fact of how deranged and how dangerous Scorpio is, as opposed to this being, all criminals need to be treated in this manner.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. It's a film that people keep debating about to this day, and of course, it also came out like during that year. That was kind of when this was becoming a big thing because of course Straw Dogs came out the same year as the first Dirty Harry, which is another kind of quasi-vigilante film at the end. But there's been a debate about both of those films about whether the actions are justified and what the film is even actually trying to say, because people have argued it either way, and I think it's kind of up to you. But both of those films do endure for a reason because they do resonate either in a positive or negative way with the viewer, which I think this film kind of plays around with too. It doesn't exactly tell you what to think about what you're watching.
Oh no, exactly. And again, pointing to Death Wish, the original Death Wish, which if you look at the origins of the project and how it originated, at one point it was to be directed by Sidney Lumet with Jack Lemmon in the lead. Well, of course, that would have been a very, very different film. But I think, unfortunately, because Winner as a filmmaker has been kind of, I think, rather underrated in recent years because of his later films, which are admittedly not very good. This doesn't take away from the fact that he made a lot of really fine films in the 60s and 70s, especially his early British films with Oliver Reed are quite good. And I would also say his films from the early 70s with Bronson, like Chatto's Land and The Mechanic, The Stone Killer, and of course Death Wish, are all very worthy films. The first Death Wish, I think, again, has more of a complexity to it than a lot of people would think. The whole concept, of course, is that Kersey is a kind of a pacifist, and I don't know if the casting of Bronson muddies the water of that idea for some people because he's just such a big, strapping man of action that people maybe don't buy that. Personally, I do. I think he plays it very well. But obviously, had it been somebody like Jack Lemmon, maybe that idea wouldn't have been misunderstood by a lot of people. But you still have in the film wonderful moments like when he has his first run-in on the street, when he has the sock full of pennies, and he's terrified. And whenever he commits his first murder, and he vomits because he's so sick to his stomach over what he's done. Again, it's this idea of somebody who's been pushed so far, he's been pushed to the limit, as this character is played by Robert Forster, who is, of course, wonderful as always in this movie. It's this idea of being pushed so far that really everybody's moral compass has the ability to break and snap if they've lost enough. So the first Death Wish, I think, has a lot more complexity going for it than a lot of people might be willing to give it credit for. Again, it's when you get to the sequels that becomes a little bit muddier because the sequels do tend to wallow a little bit in exploitation for the sake of exploitation. But a lot of that was Michael Winner just being Michael Winner and liking to provoke people. And I think because of the controversy of the first film, by the time he got to the second one, he thought, well, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to top it. And in some respects, he did.
Just really quick here, of course, this is Carol Lindley, who apparently shot for a few days on the film, stepping in for Carol Monroe. Just to correct a little debate that was going on one of the previous tracks, Carol Lindley was not the star of Baby Doll. That was Carol Baker, although different blonde Carol, but both from the same era. And it's Carol Lindley actually shot to fame in some much more sedate films, Blue Denim being one of my favorites, which was one of the first studio films about teen pregnancy. But if you want to see her at her best, she's in that, of course, along with things like The Poseidon Adventure and The Cat and the Canary, Bunny Lake is missing. But unfortunately, Carol is no longer with us. In fact, it's a little sad how many people from this film have actually died in more recent years. Of course, Robert Forster is no longer here. Woody Strode, of course, even the original actor who was supposed to be the lead, Tony Vigilante, also passed away. He was originally going to play the lead and was actually in the middle of being signed for it. According to the track, it was on the basis of his performances in The Anonymous Phoenician and Dario Argento's Birds of Crystal Plumage, although I'm surprised that a factor wasn't his role in The Incident, which of course is one of the great New York crime films, and that would have made him the logical choice for this. But we got Forster, which is great. I now can't imagine anybody else doing this part. He just fits it so well.
Oh yeah, it's true. Well, they both, Lindley and Forster, both died last year, as a matter of fact. So relatively recently that we lost them. Fred Williamson, of course, is still with us, the man, the myth, the legend. But quite a few people from the film have passed away. Lindley had survived. I think survived is the right word for it. Working with Otto Preminger on two films, The Cardinal, which actually drove Tom Tryon out of acting altogether, so he could focus on writing, and then she acted opposite Laurence Olivier in Bunny Lake is Missing, which is one of my favorite sort of weird, trippy, sort of psychological thrillers of the 1960s. She's an actress who started off with a certain degree of promise. She was nominated for Golden Globes 2 years in a row for 1959 and 1960 as the most promising newcomer. Obviously, they decided she wasn't the most promising of the batch those 2 years, but still, she was nominated. She also played Jean Harlow in the biopic Harlow. But by this stage, she was mostly doing a lot of TV, and she was showing up a lot on things like Fantasy Island and The Love Boat, which is, where a lot of actors' careers kind of went during this period of time once they had reached their sell-by date. They either were doing The Love Boat, or they were doing movies in Italy, or in some cases both. Think of actors like Christopher George and Farley Granger and many others, who had kind of slipped in the eyes of the major casting directors and weren't necessarily seen as being worthy of starring in big films. But, things like this gave them an opportunity to keep on working. I've always thought she was a highly variable actress, to be honest with you. I think she's okay in some things and very wooden in others. But I did rather like her opposite Darren McGavin in the original Night Stalker film. She plays his girlfriend in that, and I thought they had pretty nice chemistry in that. And she, after this, did a really rather terrible horror film, a Spanish-British production called The Dark Tower, which I've never been entirely clear whether the movie was started by Freddie Francis and finished by Ken Wiederhorn, or if it was the other way around. But if you're a Freddie Francis fan, it is the only movie he ever did a cameo in. So if you want to watch the film and spot Freddie, he does have a cameo in the movie. So whether he started the film or finished it, I'm not sure. But it was signed as Ken Barnett because nobody really wanted to have their name on that film. Although it had a really good cast. I mean, Carol Lindley's in it, and Jenny Agutter, Michael Moriarty, Theodore Bickel, Kevin McCarthy. It wasn't hurting on the level of actors, but it was indeed a Sandy Howard production, which is sometimes all the more you need to know.
Yes, indeed. Speaking of cameos, keep an eye out in about 25 seconds when the elevator opens. You're about to see Bill Lustig himself appear on screen. It's coming right up. I just want to make sure we don't miss that one as soon as we cut away from the scene here with Forster and Fred Williamson here. And by the way, it's also, you'll notice it later in the courtroom scene, but Carol Lindley is also playing basically a variation on the character played by Anne Bancroft in Lipstick, which is probably one of the craziest studio vigilante films. Came out in '76. Anne Bancroft plays this crusading attorney in that one. But Carol Lindley is, some of her dialogue is very Bancroft-esque if you look at the two side by side.
Yes, it's very true. And
here he is. Here he is. Hey, Bill.
Man of the hour. Yes, indeed. Thanks for all the movies. He actually, Lustig made, in more recent years, obviously he's best known for his work in sort of home video preservation and releasing so many wonderful cult movies and giving them a new life on DVD and now Blu-ray, of course, and UHD, which is, the wave of the future, apparently. In fairly rapid succession, not to say that they were made back to back to back, but over a period of about 8 years or so, he did 3, I think, really fine little movies, 3 little gems. That was, of course, Maniac, followed by Vigilante, followed by Maniac Cop. So I guess kind of a natural progression going from the Maniac film to the Vigilante film to the Maniac Cop film. So yeah, it all fits together. And of course, speaking of Maniac, Mr. Joe Spinell has entered the room. Maniac, of course, was one of his relatively few opportunities to carry a movie. And when you look at him, you can kind of understand why he wasn't typically cast in leading roles. But my God, what a wonderful actor. He's just always a delight to watch.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, you can hear the other tracks to your stories about how difficult it was wrangling him on this particular film for various reasons. Won't go into that one. But regardless of what it took, it's always welcome seeing Joe Spinell. And of course, Spinell was also had a very indelible role in Cruising. He plays one of the more bigoted cops, although unfortunately they wind up cutting what sounded like would have been his craziest scene, where it turns out he's actually into gay, submissive sex on the side when no one's looking, which I think would have been really crazy if they let that in. So alas, maybe someday they'll find that if it hasn't been chucked out of the vault somewhere.
True, true. I can't recall if he was also into cross-dressing as well. I seem to recall that might have been part of it. But yeah, I mean, his role was slightly diminished in that. But he had worked with Friedkin on other films. He was in Sorcerer, for example. He was in a lot of the big movies of the 70s, which he doesn't always get credit for because, of course, he's not playing large roles in any of them. But he's in The Godfather 1 and 2. He's in Rocky 1 and 2. He's in Taxi Driver. He's in Jaws. He was really making a lot of big films with a lot of the big shot directors of the time, like Scorsese, Coppola, Friedkin, and so forth. So, even a lot of people who may not know the name would surely know the face because he pops up in a lot of those films. He's kind of the dispatch guy in Taxi Driver that hires Travis Bickle at the beginning of the film. Don't bust my chops or whatever it is he says. And it typically has little roles, but always really stands out. And yes, by this stage, Spinell had his personal problems, which resulted in some behaviors that weren't necessarily ultra professional. Although he doesn't seem to have been a difficult man in the sense of being a kind of prima donna or anything like that. He just maybe a little scattered, a little bit distracted by other things going on in his life. And of course, also, who can forget him as the almost literally mustache twirling villain in Luigi Cozzi's Star Crash?
Of course.
And but I mean, he's wonderful. He oozes olive oil, doesn't he? He's so wonderfully kind of New York presence and very, very effective. And Lustig obviously realized the tremendous potential of him by casting him in what was undoubtedly his greatest role in Maniac, which is a film that Spinell loved dearly and even wanted to do, almost sort of make a franchise out of it, to do more films of that type. He did do another film with Caroline Munro called the Last Horror Film. And of course, we're talking about Lustig and his love of Italian genre cinema. As I'm sure a lot of people are aware, Caroline Munro was not the original choice to play the love interest in Maniac, but actually Daria Nicolodi, the star of Deep Red, was the original choice, but she turned it down because she thought the script was pretty despicable. So even though she had worked with Dario on some pretty violent films, Maniac pushed the envelope just a little bit too far for her tastes.
Yes, indeed. It's no Paganini horror, that's for sure.
Oh boy! I'll tell you what, nothing could be though.
But by the way, can I just throw in? When I just watched this film again recently, I was kind of amused that if you look at the hairstyles and the clothes on the two attorneys in this scene, it's kind of a funny comparison to the recent Noah Baumbach film Marriage Story. If you look at the scene with Ray Liotta facing off against Laura Dern, and I just started cracking up imagining if you did Marriage Story with Carol Lindley and Joe Spinell, like how much fun that would have been to watch.
I would much prefer that to what we got. I can't say I was very fond of Marriage Story, but Joe Spinell and Carol Lindley, yes, indeed, that would make all the difference.
Yeah, but I'm serious. Watch these two scenes like side by side. It's actually pretty amusing how similar they are.
That's actually funny. I mean, Spinell, again, he obviously was not graced with what we called movie star looks, but he was graced with character actor looks, which made him perfect for so many of these films that he showed up in, whether the roles sometimes were even unbilled. He would just sort of show up briefly in the background or whatever, but always managed to grab your attention because he had that very distinctive look. And I think that's the aspect that some people have a hard time with when it comes to Maniac, because of course he has this relationship with Caroline Munro, who's one of the most beautiful women in the world, and some people have take exception to that. But stranger things have happened.
Yeah, I mean, Billy Joel, Mary Christie Brinkley, so anything's possible, I guess.
There you go. And who was it that Julia Roberts was with? Lyle Lovett,
Yeah.
for a period of time. So yeah, things happen. We can't always be in a position to say that everybody should be movie star attractive. Sometimes personality goes a very long way indeed. And personality he had bucketful of, because he was just, again, just even in a part like this, which isn't really a great showcase for him. He only has a couple of scenes, but yeah, he grabs each scene by the shirt collar and really makes it his own.
That he absolutely does. Always great fun to watch as well.
And apparently, not to cross over too much to what Bill Lustig says on one of the other commentaries, but he had an idea for a backstory involving him and Carol Lindley, which
Yes.
could have been very amusing, but Lustig put his foot down on that one.
Had that occurred, it would have had a very unusual effect on the pacing of this film, I think, had it occurred right here. I don't know how
It's
they would
very
have pulled
true.
that off.
It's very true, but you can't blame him for trying.
No, yeah, just imagine, like, if this is going on, suddenly dissolved to, like, him and Carol Lindley rolling around in the surf kissing. Priceless.
Turns into From Here to Eternity for a brief period of time.
Yeah, would have been like a little airplane moment all of a sudden in the middle of the movie.
Yes, fortunately, Lustig had enough storytelling sense to realize that's not such a good idea, Joe, but thanks for suggesting it anyway.
Yep.
But Robert Forster, of course, wonderful in this film, as he always is. I love his little freak out here, as I think anybody would react this way when they realize the corruption that's going on. And again, this is sort of tugging at the audience's heartstrings in the sense of we know what is going on, and we're of course entirely on his side. So it does really brings up that question of how far would you go if something like this happened to you? Would you take to the streets and do something like this or not? So again, it is kind of asking you to put yourself in the position of this character and question that for yourself. But Forster, of course, it had a very interesting career. It started off playing the object of Marlon Brando's desire in Reflections in the Golden Eye, which is one of the strangest films from a major studio by a major director, in this case John Huston. Wonderfully deranged movie that I'm very fond of. He'd gone on to co-star with Gregory Peck in The Stalking Moon, and of course Top Line Medium Cool for Haskell Wexler. But by this time, his career was slightly, I don't want to say necessarily on the skids, but he wasn't really getting a lot of big films or, the kinds of assignments that he necessarily entirely deserved. He had played the hero in Disney's The Black Hole, where he was, and virtually everybody was obliterated on screen by Maximilian Schell, who couldn't hold up with Maximilian Schell in that film is impossible. But
Borgnine tries, though.
He does, yeah. Borgnine certainly tries, and Perkins, puts in a good effort too, and Forster's fine. But yeah, I mean, it's the old story about who's more interesting, the sort of square-jawed villain or the eccentric, or the square-jawed hero or the eccentric villain. Well, I know where my interest is going to go to. But around this time, he had shown up in Goliath Awaits with Christopher Lee and John Carradine. He risked being canceled playing a Middle Easterner in the Delta Force. He worked with Jess Franco, of all people, on Esmeralda Bay. And he actually did 2 Alfred Hitchcock movie remakes, Rear Window and probably more notoriously Psycho, where he played the psychiatrist character at the end of the film who kind of explains the plot to everybody. But naturally, he had his major kind of comeback with Jackie Brown, thanks to Quentin Tarantino, which is still my favorite Tarantino movie, and largely because of Robert Forster. Until the end of his days, he was still working. He had a nice role as Ed, the vacuum salesman on Breaking Bad, and then showed up in an episode of Better Call Saul. Unfortunately, as we said before, died in 2019, so no longer with us, but what a wonderful actor.
Yes, indeed. And of course, he was actually, as we mentioned earlier, he was not the first choice for this film, but he was, of course, cast on the strength of his lead performance in Louis Teague's Alligator,
Yes.
which, for my money, is one of the 80s greatest monster films. It's just a blast. Unfortunately, it's stuck in legal hell right now, but hopefully it'll come back into circulation at some point. But yeah, he's really, really fine in that. What the odd thing is that after he made this film, he actually took what I think is the longest professional break in his whole career. There's actually like a 3-year gap. Like I said, this first started showing in '82, and he didn't do anything else until '85. He popped up in another film with Joseph Spinell called Walking the Edge, as well as a Magnum PI 2-parter. But yeah, Delta Force is in '85 is really the one that kind of put him back on the map a bit, where he plays this kind of ridiculous scenery chomping Palestinian terrorist in that one, which is quite something to behold. Definitely not his most politically correct role, but it's a lot of
No.
fun and like nothing else in his filmography. I think it's safe to say.
Yeah, well, it's always fun to see actors like that who are known for being, I don't want to say stoic, but sort of, generally playing more restrained characters get a chance to really cut loose, and that's a ton of fun. So, politically correct, no, I'm sure it would inspire a certain amount of blowback these days, and deservedly so on a certain level. Oh, that's pretty nasty too. And apparently, that poor kid really was in a wheelchair, and they really did that to him.
Yeah. So now I have to say, if you're going to cast the head of a vigilante gang, a neighborhood protection gang, first of all, Fred Williamson is the guy to do it. But what kind of
Yes.
idiot would actually try to get away from Fred Williamson? I mean, if I were a crook and I saw Fred Williamson coming to me, if I saw the Hammer coming after me, I would just kind of freeze and just drop to the ground. You know?
Yeah, deer in the headlights sort of thing there. Although he gives him a run for his money, you got to give him credit. It leads to a pretty exciting little chase scene and some fancy stunt work, which Williamson would later complain he didn't think was covered properly because there's a lot of cutting away from things that he was actually doing. Jumps like this, he said I could have jumped from an apple cart too. Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, probably should have been staged a little bit wider, but still, yeah, Fred Williamson is really one of the great sort of screen tough guys from my point of view. I've always just immensely enjoyed seeing him. And of course, he had a nice a kind of late career renaissance thanks to From Dusk Till Dawn. So another kind of Tarantino, rescue story there on a certain level, I suppose. Although he was also part of the Italian film scene that inspired Lustig, and he ended up doing some movies for Enzo Castellari, for example, as well as Lucio Fulci's New Gladiator. So got around a good bit.
Yeah. As of course did, you saw him for just a minute in the earlier scene here, and you'll see him again shortly. Woody Strode, of course, who was quite the Italian film veteran. He's in numerous spaghetti westerns, of course, as well as quite a few American films since his big breakthrough appearance, of course, in Spartacus. But yeah, you can spot him in lots of those. But I think that's also part of Lustig's passion for Italian genre cinema. One of his shorter but more indelible roles would, of course, be in the opening of Once Upon a Time in the West.
Oh, yes.
Of course, which is hard to forget, which makes amazing use of Woody Strode's face.
Yes, well, I mean, when we talk about Tarantino as well and the influence of Italian films on that, one of my favorite poliziotteschi is The Italian Connection, and the casting of Henry Silva and Woody Strode as the hitmen in that movie was definitely on Tarantino's mind when he wrote the Travolta and Samuel L. Jackson characters in Pulp Fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just love the New York location coverage in this film like this right here. I love all the graffiti and just the way everything feels kind of lived in and just kind of skeevy. You really just can't recreate this anymore. But this is seen as a really great example. Just every single shot here, it's like, yeah, this absolutely just feels like early 80s New York 100%. Because I remember exactly the way that it smelled and the way that it felt being there at the time.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. It's something that there's a lot of nostalgia for it nowadays, although whether you'd really want to walk through it, especially at night, would be another thing. But there was this kind of quote-unquote Disneyfication of New York that took place in the 90s, and all of that kind of, 42nd Street and all the grindhouses and the porno theaters and the porno shops and, hookers on every corner and everything that you see that seems such a cliche were absolutely true. I mean, it was definitely what New York City was for a period of time, but yeah, this is a very, very different period of time now, and there's no going home when it comes to that. But again, a lot of movies from during this period. Another one of my great favorite kind of New York set thrillers of this period is definitely Lucio Fulci's New York Ripper, which really captures the sleaze and the grime of it beautifully.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And another one that I love, I should probably mention that. I also love the fact that in this time period when you had the vigilante films, before they got sort of cartoonish, you had films like this one where Robert Forster kind of becomes more sort of stoic for the most part and internal as his course changes, but also something like, say, Abel Ferrara's Ms. 45, which came out just before this, but is sort of the female version, but that's also where it's about a mute woman who becomes a vigilante after she is attacked, and the way that she has sort of, and also a very sort of internalized transformation that happens where she has to convey it through her eyes, not unlike what Forster does over the course of this film.
Yeah, there's another interesting one that's kind of disappeared from view somewhat. A very interesting film I haven't seen in many years, but have fond memories of, called Night of the Juggler.
Yeah.
Which
also
is
stuck in legal
one.
hell right now, unfortunately, but hopefully they can untangle it. Yeah.
Hopefully. Well, of course, here's Woody Strode, as we were mentioning before, wonderful Woody Strode. typical of so many black actors during this period, and certainly early in his period. I mean, he was appearing in things like the Ten Commandments for DeMille, for example. Very rarely had an opportunity to really shine. But John Ford took a shine to him and actually gave him one of his relatively few leading roles. He plays the title character in Sergeant Rutledge, for example, and. As you mentioned, he was in Spartacus. He had a very good role in Spartacus, and went to Italy, as so many of these actors did. Poliziotteschi-wise, did a couple films for Fernando De Leo. I mentioned The Italian Connection, which I dearly love, and Loaded Weapons, which I don't love, but still has its moments. Some of them thanks very much to Woody Strode, who is always, I think, putting in a very good appearance and a good performance. Unfortunately, he's another one who's no longer with us, but he remained active all the way until his death in 1994. His last film was Sam Raimi's The Quick and the Dead, which is one of those movies I wish I liked and I don't, because it's just something about the film doesn't work for me, but it has a really interesting cast, and definitely Woody Strode is always most welcome.
Yeah, I mean, that's about as spaghetti westerny as an American film can get. I mean, Raimi's really all over that one. I think casting Strode is probably one of the more overt nods to that film, of course, which also quotes from Sergio Leone and whatnot. But yeah, it's always nice seeing Woody pop up in anything, and that film is no exception.
Oh yeah, and of course, he'd also done The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance for Ford, and even later on showed up in The Cotton Club for Francis Ford Coppola. So he had some pretty distinguished credits and worked with some really interesting people through his career. Again, always dependable. I don't know that he was ever necessarily a major star on the level of some of the. Let's be honest, the white actors at the time who were more accepted by virtue of the fact that, these were different times and different mentalities and so forth. But Strode made a really, really strong impression during a time when it was very, very difficult for a lot of black actors to make a mark in Hollywood.
Yeah, for sure. And something about Williamson, I shared that he sort of got this perception that as he gives these sort of indulgent performances where he's always chopping the cigar and kind of just being Fred Williamson. I think in this film, he steps outside his zone a little bit. You get to see kind of a darker, more dangerous Fred Williamson here, and I kind of like it. That opening shot, of course, of him, in the darkness, kind of sets the tone right away. And it's I actually like seeing him a little outside of his comfort zone in this one. You can see right here, it's like he's kind of a live wire in this movie, and I kind of wish he'd explored that a little bit more. You don't see this too much in his other films. He's always much more in control. He always had the rules that he always had, where he never loses a fight and he always gets the girl and whatnot. But yeah, this feels a little bit more than your usual Williamson role, which I appreciate.
No, I definitely agree with that, and I think it is nice to see the Hammer bringing a little bit more depth to a character, as opposed to, again, the sort of typical cigar chomping thing that he did. And he did really, really well. Obviously, it was something that it was a screen persona that he was very protective of, and a lot of actors are like that. Obviously, Bronson had his persona, Eastwood had his persona, but a lot of different actors who were able to sustain themselves a little bit more and enjoy longer success were the ones who tended to be willing to play around with that a little bit. Eastwood's a good example of that. He didn't just sort of settle into that image that he had, but he would always kind of go outside the box and do things you wouldn't expect him to do. So it's nice when you have an opportunity to see Fred Williamson do something that has a little bit more kind of going on, as opposed to some of the more tongue-in-cheek, I think, kind of stuff that he tends to be known for. He's very, very convincing. And again, he has several speeches in this film that are just done with such fire and brimstone. They're just beautifully done.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's not to say anything against his usual performances. Like I said, it's always nice to have that kind of little tweaking of the star personality when they do that. When they know how to do it just right. Where you're like, oh yeah, that's kind of a neat little variation there. Didn't expect that.
Yeah, and of course he would work with Robert Forster again on Original Gangstas, which was a Larry Cohen film that Williamson was very much involved with. Of course, Williamson had worked with Larry Cohen back in the '70s on things like
Black Caesar,
Black Caesar, yeah, which were, at Hell Up in Harlem, were very successful movies that came out during the blaxploitation boom of the 70s, which really were the movies that made him into a box office star. But Original Gangsta is a much more kind of tongue-in-cheek and lighthearted affair that came later on, kind of an attempt to recapture the magic of some of those earlier films. And it was fun to see those guys working together again.
Yeah, and so This scene is a nice example of, I think the look of this film is really striking because if you see Maniac, you know it was actually shot in 16 millimeter, and it looks it. There's of course a 4K release of it out now, which looks great. But of course 16 has just a limited amount of depth and detail that you can achieve in the night scenes. The darker scenes have just kind of, it is what it is, but they're kind of sort of flat. And here you have this beautiful, first of all it's shot in scope, and it's 35 millimeter, and you have that really beautiful, like kind of inky darkness here. Which was something very peculiar to the time, especially the late 70s, early 80s. They have this certain look that you see right here. Which again is you can't replicate, especially digital. Just can't quite get this the way that film does. If you ever see it projected, especially, it's just really beautiful. Cruising, of course, has that in spades as well, but it's something you see all over the place. A lot of the stuff that Vilmos Zsigmond shot, for example, really uses that really nicely. Just this beautiful darkness. John Carpenter also, again, if you look at something like The Fog or Christine, especially, uses it really well. But that's something I love about this film is that just the texture of it that you see right here. It's just an atmosphere that I just really love.
Oh, absolutely, and of course, any discussion of darkness, you have to bring up Gordon Willis,
yes.
Of course, the Prince of Darkness, as he was known, whose approach to lighting really upset Paramount early on The Godfather, and at a time when just about everybody looked like they were about to be fired on that film. Because they were approaching it in a way that the studio really wasn't expecting and were concerned that people wouldn't like. But of course, even today, and obviously filmmaking has changed and aesthetics have changed, and certain things are more readily accepted than they used to be. Even to this day, I saw The Godfather on the big screen with an audience just a couple of years back. And the darkness of that film is still very unusual. It's still very striking when you see it on the big screen, even with all the detail and everything that's there. It's relatively unusual to have films like that, and indeed this too, where there are moments where so much of the frame is just completely covered in darkness.
And speaking of covering the whole frame, this scene here has been remarked on quite a bit.
Well,
first of all, I should mention this is Robert Forster kind of going back to his early glory days. He actually started off being one of the first actors to really be the vanguard at nudity on screen. Of course, Reflections into Goldeneye, the fact that he rides naked on horseback is a major plot point.
Yes.
But for the history books, he was also the very first American actor to go full frontal on film in medium cool, although he kind of had his thunder stolen that year by Alan Bates and Oliver Reed, Women in Love, which is the more famous example. But yeah, he did have his place in the history books. So. And of course, this guy here, the big, bulky, menacing guy, going back to Cruising, that is Henry Judd Baker, who I think has one of the most outrageous moments in that film. Of course, he's the guy in the jockstrap who comes out and starts bitch slapping a suspect based on real life, of course, believe it or not. But quite a veteran actor as well. He had a multi-episode arc on Dark Shadows, and also turned up in things like Oliver Stone's Seizure and The Mighty Quinn. So it's very amusing seeing him pop up here and again. It just cements that Cruising connection even more.
It's just a shame he's not wearing the cowboy hat.
I know. That would have been great. Nice little collie. It could have been the same character,
He could be. He could be. I think that scene in Cruising. Oh, yep, there you go. You just bitch slap. Yeah. Everybody remembers that scene, whether you like the movie or not. And of course, Al Pacino's reaction is the audience's reaction. Who is this guy? It's hysterically funny, but it is indeed something that, as per Randy Jurgensen, who we were talking about earlier, the New York police were not above doing that sort of thing in order to catch people off guard. So let's get this big guy and put him in a jockstrap and come in here and bitch slap somebody, and that's just going to confuse them enough that they might give something away. Apparently, these things really did happen. I don't know if they still happen or not, but yeah, I mean,
I hope they do. I really do.
I don't want to find out. I don't want to be the one to find out. Let's put it that way. I'd rather not go through that myself. But if somebody else wants to, if you want to go out there and get yourself arrested and report back to me, we'll confirm this later on that this is still done. But yeah, it's funny, and the scene. Of course, Lustig was aware of that, and of course, Lustig is doing a callback to it here because it's just so. Even the way it's shot, again, those sort of low angle shots on this guy who's a big guy, coming into the frame, and a bitch slapping poor Robert Forster in the shower. It's definitely meant to evoke that. Although I don't think there were probably too many filmmakers in the early '80s who were looking to quote Cruising, because Cruising was really eviscerated when it came out in 1980.
Yeah, it took a long time for that one to get rehabilitated, although it definitely has now. I don't see really much vitriol being thrown at that one at all. Oddly enough, it seems like Boys in the Band, I think, gets much more hate now than Cruising does, which is kind of an odd turn of events, because that was absolutely not the case in the 80s at all.
No, I mean, I still see the occasional accusations of homophobia against Cruising, but again, it's the same thing we were talking before about the fascist label being thrown at Dirty Harry and Death Wish and things like that. I think the movie's a good deal more complex than that. And again, it's one of those things, whether one likes to acknowledge it or not, it is based a lot in reality. There was apparently a lot of research done in terms of the different clubs and things like that that did exist, kind of underground clubs. The very heavy S&M type scene that was around in the early 80s. It may not seem particularly sensitive on a certain level, but I mean, what can you do? That did exist.
Yeah, I mean, again, like we were talking about the Vigilante films, but that Cruising as well, I think it doesn't tell you what to feel, which I think threw people off a lot because they would see things on screen they'd never seen before. And so if you had that uncomfortable reaction, you tend to project that back on the film, like, oh, the film's making me feel this way, therefore it's terrible or it's tasteless. And it's like, well, no, it's just saying, here it is,
Right.
make of it what you will. It's actually a very ambiguous film, like
Yeah.
from top to bottom, basically, which is, again, like the Vigilante films. It's not really spoon-feeding you anything at all. And I don't think people are comfortable with the ideas that these bring up, and it just really hits them in kind of a sensitive spot.
If there is a contemporary parallel to be made to these films, and I think there is, I think the director that comes to mind for me is S. Craig Zahler,
Yeah.
who, of course, with Dragged Across Concrete, made a movie that many people reacted to in the same way that a lot of people reacted to Death Wish back in the 70s and Dirty Harry in the 70s as well.
Yeah.
Because there again, you're presented with characters who are rather complex and ambiguous, and you kind of like them, but at the same time, you don't like them. And that's the whole point. And unfortunately, because in his films, and I think it's also true of Brawl and Cell Block 99, which is one of my absolute favorite films of recent years, it's not beating you over the head telling you what you're supposed to feel. And I think that makes a lot of viewers very uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's kind of a lost art now, although I would also put Lars von Trier in that same category as someone who's a bit of a provocateur but doesn't tell you what to think. Most recently, The House that Jack Built, I think, hit some of the same spots as well because it is very disturbing and it doesn't quite tell you what you're supposed to think about the ending of it. And it's still being debated to this day, and of course, it only recently just even got released uncut in the U.S. So, but yeah, that's very much in the same vein as something like Maniac. The whole what was going on in the time period. I think he and Zoller are both, obviously in different countries and different aspects, but they're all kind of children of that approach.
Absolutely, and we were talking before about censorship as well on this particular film, and this
Yeah.
was a scene that was cut. We're going to get some nice squib action coming up here as Fred Williamson gets his revenge on this character. But yeah, it's not completely unheard of nowadays. There are indeed people who still do value the beauty of ambiguity, but it becomes less and less common, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's become more kind of a comforting thing in mainstream cinema for everything to just be sort of pat and obvious and to tell us exactly what we're supposed to feel and tie everything up neatly and nicely at the end of the film where you have a epilogue or something that assures you that everything is okay, even when you're dealing with a really very unpleasant kind of subject matter. There's usually that kind of comforting out to send people home feeling a little bit better about themselves.
Yeah, most certainly. And by the way, I think the first time this film was ever seen uncensored at all was, I believe, when the Laserdisc came out, which I think was from the Roan Group, I believe. But yeah, when you saw this theatrically, quite a bit of the juiciness was cut, although oddly enough, not the scenes that Lustig thought would be censored, for example. Luckily,
Yes.
the child murder, of course, being left intact. So it is curious what would hit the MPA's sore spot. You never could predict exactly what would set them off. But yeah, that was the era back then.
They're a strange beast, the MPAA. It's the old John Landis joke about what does he say? An R rating is when you show a breast. PG is when you cut it off. So it's kind of we go through different periods of time, and of course that has a lot to do with politics, and it has a lot to do with sort of society as a whole. And there's certain times when violence is okay and sex isn't. And there's other times when sex is okay and violence isn't. And we go through a lot of really bizarre kinds of variations on these routines at different points. You look at certain films or even TV shows from different periods, and you think, God, they couldn't be made today, even though they were made 30, 40 years ago. But on the other hand, there are certain things that we can show today that we wouldn't have been able to show then. So it's always kind of evolving in weird sort of ways.
Yeah, it really is. But I mean, even at the time this came out, if this, if I'd come across this on HBO, uncut, I would have never have seen this as something that would have gotten an X rating. That just seems, even for an 82, 83 film, that just seems absolutely bizarre compared to what was coming out at the time. I mean, this was also when, again, it's also screwy because, of course, something like Jaws got a PG rating, which seems, even still seems pretty unfathomable when you watch it. But that was, the clout of the studio at the time. So I think had this been a major studio film, maybe they wouldn't have gotten such a hard time about it. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, that's always been the case, of course, is the famous story about when Hammer submitted The Curse of the Werewolf to the BBFC and they demanded all these cuts and they really eviscerated that film. At one point, the producer, Anthony Hines, said that Psycho was a lot more graphic, and they pretty much said, well, Terrence Fisher is an Alfred Hitchcock, So it's kind of, it's sometimes it's based very much on who you are, too, but you mentioned 1971 before, of course, a great banner year for controversial cinema. And I mean, it really was never a year that was quite comparable to it. And the censors really had their hands busy that year with movies like Dirty Harry, A Clockwork Orange, The Devils, Straw Dogs. Even Mario Bava's Twitch of the Death Nerve, which was far and away the bloodiest film that he ever made, and really one of the bloodiest genre films that had been made, period, at that time. There were all these movies that were really sort of pushing the envelope, and funnily enough, we talked a lot about Dirty Harry, and for obvious reasons, but of that group of films, that's probably the mildest of the bunch, certainly as far as bloodshed and exploitation are concerned.
Oh, yeah, and speaking of child killing, of course, that was the same year we had Rowan Polanski's Macbeth, which has a very graphic family slaughter scene in it. And I mean, the fact that that wasn't slapped with an X, I think, has to do with the fact that it was, it's Shakespeare, it's Polanski, so they got away with it. But I mean, that's still a pretty strong film when you look at it. If it was any of those batches besides The Devils, I would have thought, and Straw Dogs, I would have thought that one for sure would have gotten an X, but that didn't have any problem at all. So go figure.
Yeah, funnily enough, even though it was Playboy produced it, you'd think that would have been a mark against it. But now, if Polanski had made it a few years later, I probably would have done. But that's a separate topic for another time. But at that time, he was, he was accepted as a great artist, of course, which he is. But attitudes towards him would change a little bit later after some real life experiences got in the way of his reputation. But yeah, I mean, that was really an amazing year. And when you think about the movies that came out, and some of those films still really pack a major punch. Definitely Macbeth still does, for example. And Straw Dogs, of course, I don't think Straw Dogs is ever going to be anything less than problematic for a lot of people because, of course, the very famous, or I should say infamous in particular, rape scene that's kind of the centerpiece of the movie. Talk about making people uncomfortable because they're not really telling them what you're supposed to feel. It's a very complex sequence that I would argue is not in any way gratuitous, but it definitely pushes buttons.
It definitely does, and of course that it opens up a whole lot of debates that we won't go into, but still going today. There's still cases of people being there's still accusations that come up that deal with what Straw Dogs does, which is where, when you cross that line between consensual and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, this is definitely not what I signed up for at all. So,
yes.
Yeah. Of course, Lustig getting his full-on Suspiria mode here. The Blue Lining, this is very Argento, of course, so no surprise that he, of course, was the guy who brought that film back to us. But yeah, I love how it just goes super stylish and kind of Euro crazy in the sequence all of a sudden.
Yeah, well, there's another Argento kind of vague connection to Argento in this film, and that's the casting director, Louis DeGiamo, who was a very significant casting director, worked on a ton of big, high-profile movies like The Godfather and The Exorcist, but he was also the casting director on Argento's American-made giallo film Trauma from 1992. So there you go. A little connection there. But yeah, Lustig has always been very openly indebted to those films, and in many respects, it makes sense that after a certain point, when he decided to take focus away from actually making films, to focus a little bit more on kind of film preservation and releasing films to video in editions that in many respects were quite deluxe, for their time. He would be on the forefront of that with things like, the long overdue, long awaited release of Suspiria, which wasn't just a video release, but also, there was even a brief VHS and later on a Laserdisc release in widescreen, which was almost unheard of during that period of time. We take it for granted now the films are presented in widescreen, but for a period of time that certainly was not the case.
Yeah, I recall I was at my very first job I ever held when I was first legally old enough to work. I was working at a video store, and we first got the sell sheet for Suspiria, and it said they were simultaneously issuing the letterbox and pan and scan. My heart almost leaped out of my throat when I saw that. I couldn't believe it. So back in the day when that was a true rarity, I think things like Manhattan and maybe a couple of others were the only ones scope films you could actually see letterboxed on video. So yeah, thank you, Bill Lustig. You were a trailblazer, and he's largely get the credit for where we are now. Now we have all these films in their correct aspect ratio, like what we're seeing now. Because if you ever try to see Vigilante pan and scan, it ain't pretty, folks.
No, I fortunately have never had to suffer through this one pan and scan. I didn't catch up with it until later, actually, when they first put it out on Blu-ray. I don't know what year that was. Might have been around 2010 or so. Yeah, that was my first exposure to the film. Of course, it became a favorite right away. But looking at Robert Forster here, I do wonder, going back to the Argento connection, what would Tony Musante have been like in this part? That could have been interesting. Tony Musante had a slightly creepier edge to him than Forster does. Forster has this kind of very down to earth, very regular Joe Blow kind of a vibe going, whereas Musante by this stage in particular, maybe because he was playing a lot more villain roles. I mean, I mentioned The Equalizer before, and which is a show I just love so very much, and he showed up in an episode, a very memorable episode of The Equalizer, playing a villain. So I think he would have brought a slightly different temperament to this film.
Yeah, Musante often has kind of sort of a bemused quality that Forster doesn't really have. I mean, not to say that Forster doesn't have a sense of humor, but Musante always just has this kind of sort of quizzical kind of look, like he's having a little private joke sometimes, which I think might have been a little bit at odds with this film. If maybe he would have had to tamp that down just a little bit. I guess we'll never know, of course, since it never happened.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how he would have worked also with Britannia Alda, whereas Forster and her, they have limited time together, but I think they work well together. So, yeah, it would have been interesting, certainly. I mean, I'm not entirely sure what it was that happened with Tony Musante, why he, kind of, well, I have my suspicions what happened. Certainly there were opportunities that he had that he blew. Obviously he was involved in a show called Toma, which morphed into Beretta, which became a big deal, and he burned a lot of bridges, I think is probably the short answer to that. But there was a period of time where he was kind of poised for stardom. Obviously he had done The Incident, which is, again, a really fantastic New York set thriller, movie about sort of youth violence and, the kind of random violence that can happen to innocent people. But then he had this period of time, did a few films in Italy like Companeros and Bird with the Crystal Plumage and The Anonymous Venetian and The Love Circle. But really never quite translated into the big name star that I think he had the talent to become, but maybe, again, it was just his personality kind of grated on people in the wrong way. I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few stories about his temperament not necessarily syncing up with his directors or his fellow cast members, which I think was probably a big factor in it as well. It's easy to find out who we're talking about if you look it up. So.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, he would have been interesting. I would have liked to have seen him in this part, but it's one of those things, I can't really look at this film and say, oh, if only Tony Musante would have done this, it would have been a better film. No, I think it works perfectly fine as it is. Yeah. And, of course, I should mention, too, Steve James,
yes,
who is only briefly in the film, and he kind of, was on his way to becoming a big star. He had been a stuntman and he became an actor, but unfortunately he died very young. He was only 41. He had pancreatic cancer. So, but it worked on some interesting films. He was in The Warriors, for example, and To Live and Die in L.A. again, William Friedkin, and probably most famously, inevitably, sadly for the time, he was relegated to playing the kind of sidekick to Michael Dudikoff in the American Ninja movies, which Steve James was just a better actor, let's be honest. So it's a shame that his career didn't go a little bit further than what it did.
Yeah. Well, as we mentioned on this commentary, though, apparently all roads lead to Cannon one way or another.
It's true. It's true. They were the mecca in the 1980s, and it's easy to kind of laugh at their output nowadays in some respects, but God, do I miss them.
Yeah, this scene here is very Maniac. Of course, we're calling Tom Savini's demise in that film. If there was any doubt that Lustig was the hand behind both films, this one seals it right here.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I definitely missed the whole Cannon thing, which again I think Cannon is an outgrowth of what you find in this film, the kind of the exploitation vibe that was going on at the time in Cannon, just kind of like threw it right through the roof. which is very appropriate for the mid '80s when they really ascended. But yeah, I think well, like they've also been reappraised quite a bit. They were kind of a joke at the time. I think a lot of people were not terribly upset when they folded, but of course now I think we miss it, and a lot of their films have become major cult films with good reason, and there are a lot of canon fan groups and documentaries and things. So, yeah, it's curious to see what winds up enduring in the long run, because I think a lot of people never thought canon would be remembered after it closed shop, but it most certainly has.
It's true, and the thing is nowadays, and we see this with a lot of different genres. We can see it with the Giallo films, for example. We can see it with canon type movies. There are movies that are made that are definitely homages to them, but what they tend to get wrong is they tend to be a little too self-conscious about what they're doing. It's like they set out to make cult movies instead of just making movies. I don't think that Golden Globus, for example, were trying to do anything more than just make films that were going to entertain an audience. I don't think that they were being self-consciously sort of winking at the audience about anything.
Yeah. And I think since you mentioned Zoller, but I think in a way he's kind of like the more respectable, like modern version of canon. It's kind of the same approach, where it takes exploitation elements and grabs a bunch of available actors who may not be necessarily A-listers and just kind of throws them in a blender the way canon used to, and the way this film does actually as well. Again, that was an approach that worked at the time, and as he's proven, it still works today. They may not pack him in the theaters, but there's definitely an audience, at least on home video for sure.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, Zoller, just to go with him for a moment. I mean, he's doing something very similar to what Tarantino does, but I think in a less self-conscious way. And I think, not as verbose, for example, as opposed to Tarantino's movies, which tend to be a little bit more sort of dialogue heavy and so forth. So in a way, I think he's kind of capturing the vibe and the aesthetic of the 80s and 70s types films, which again were a little bit more of an emphasis on grittiness and also on action, as opposed to people sitting around and talking a lot.
Yeah, and Tarantino, as much as he nods exploitation films, there's nothing really canon-esque about him at all. Again, he's more towards things like classic martial arts and European cinema in particular, whereas I think like Zoller and even Lusted, of course, are more sort of the red meat and potatoes kind of vibe, just pure all-American, sex and violence cinema, mostly the violence part that carries
Absolutely.
on. I think the fact that studios don't really exploit that anymore is more the reason we don't see it, because obviously demand is there. It's just that studios would rather, rake in billions on, comic book films as opposed to sort of delivering the exploitation. Although now, of course, we're recording this in the COVID era, and now what's going on with the drive-ins right now, it's proving that actually you can bring out an audience for this kind of stuff when the studios aren't willing to put their fare out there. People are releasing stuff like The Wretched, for example, which suddenly became #1 because exploitation sells. You don't have to have millions of dollars behind it. It still works.
It's true. I mean, the same basic principle still holds true. And if you put a trailer out there for an audience that packs in enough action and sleaze and violence and everything else, people are going to go. They're going to be interested in it. So there's been it's a weird thing. I mean, obviously, filmmaking has morphed and changed and so forth. I mean, you go back to the days of the studio era, where you had the different studios who all had their very distinctive kind of signature style and subject matter. They had the same casts and crews. I mean, they had all these people that were under contract, so you always could recognize an MGM film versus a Paramount film, for example, versus a Universal picture, or certainly a Monogram film or whatever. And then as that sort of fell out of favor as the 1960s wore on, you had this period of the kind of mavericks. The maverick filmmakers and also the maverick producers like Robert Evans, who really deeply cared about movies. They really loved movies, and that's the thing that really drove those films. And then, unfortunately, after a certain point, it's turned into a thing where it's basically accountants and businessmen who run studios, and it's always very calculated in terms of what's it worth financially to take a risk on a certain thing, to an extent that you could even have a situation like we had in recent years that Martin Scorsese had to turn to Netflix to get funding to make a gangster movie starring Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, and Joe Pesci and Harvey Keitel. I mean, it seems like a no-brainer that a studio would want to do it, and yet Paramount decided to bail on it after a very different film that Scorsese made called Silence didn't connect with audiences. Well, it was never going to be a big box office movie. It's a small arty type film, so kind of a ridiculous thing. So filmmaking has changed down through the years, and what we have nowadays, not to belittle everything that's made, because there's still great films that come out every year. And there's still talented people out there that are making really interesting and creative and provocative films. But what we tend to see at the Cineplex usually is a lot of the big tentpole things like the superhero movies, a lot of remakes, and basically movies that are kind of safe sells, whereas the edgier fare tends to get kind of relegated to smaller distribution, and usually will find its audience on home video as opposed to theatrical runnings, which, as somebody who grew up in the 80s, I can remember going to see movies blind, not having a clue what I was going to go see, because it was a very different period. It wasn't like, now where, thanks to social media, we hear everything there is to hear about a movie before we have a chance to see it, so nothing's a surprise. But the things that were playing in theaters back in the 80s were just wonderfully eclectic and off the wall, and at times surprising in a good way. So yeah, I mean, the whole model has just changed tremendously, and of course it's not going to go back to what it was anytime soon.
No, yeah, I mean, the main thing was the variety, which you don't get anymore. I mean, you've got, Star Wars playing on every single screen out there. That kind of tells you all you need to know right there. But of course, again, you mentioned Netflix, which I think has actually helped bring some of these back in the word of mouth factor. I think something like Extraction, for example, is a good example of where they just kind of popped up out of nowhere, which is, I think, one of the more ferocious action films of recent years. That was a really nice surprise and became a gargantuan hit. It was a huge word of mouth thing. All of a sudden, everyone's talking about it. So, yeah, I mean, obviously the demand is most certainly there. I think maybe the time is ripe. What do you think? Since it worked with Maniac, maybe they should have Elijah Wood do a remake of Vigilante. What do you think?
Ooh, well, he could be interesting, but only if he plays the Fred Williamson role, though.
There you go. Okay.
I think. Why not? Yes, Maniac, of course. The remake is one of the relatively few examples of a real remake. I make a distinction between movies that are remakes of original films as opposed to adaptations of books, which I think is a very different kind of principle. Mm-hmm. But that was a very respectable job. I mean, well done as far as that goes. Just the idea of remaking that particular film, particularly nowadays when the sensitivity levels are very, very different. That took a certain amount of guts, and good for them for creating something that was very different from the original, but at the same time, kind of also wonderfully queasy in its own way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I'd be curious how this would adapt these days, when, of course, we have a lot of discussion about, again, police corruption and race relations and things like that. I think you could do a kind of a nifty modern spin on this film.
Sure.
Dealing with some of the conversations that are going on right now. I think the time might be ripe. So
I have a feeling if they did it, it would probably be a Jason Statham vehicle.
Yeah, maybe. Or it could be instead of going out, they could address it more directly with the whole corrupt cop thing instead of just the gang members. I think you could introduce the upper corruption element quite a bit earlier, but it could be kind of fun seeing maybe a Black Lives Matter era version of this. I think you could really be onto something with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, this was a period of time. I mean, there's always been some controversy over, the idea of police corruption and, bad cops versus good cops, and are there any good cops, and all these kinds of discussions that continue to go on into the 21st century. But it was really, I think, starting to rear its head a lot during the 1980s. And there was a lot going on in the 80s, really, that made it into a particularly interesting era, but also kind of a death knell era for a lot of the types of films that we love so much, because it was almost like the morning after all the excess of the 70s, where it was all kind of, everybody was going out to the discos and having promiscuous sex and doing lots of drugs and holding down jobs on Wall Street and everything else. And then AIDS happens, and Reagan gets into the White House, and the kind of climate changes, and it kind of turns into this big apology for everything that was going on for so long, which was, a period of great fun, I'm sure. I'm sorry I wasn't there to experience it, but, the 80s was very much the kind of response to that in some respects. And movies like this in the early part of the decade were definitely, they were thick on the ground at the time, but as the decade wore on, a lot of that started to change and shift into a slightly more conservative kind of a landscape.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't just exploitation in general. I remember it vividly when all of a sudden, like all the indie films, all the horror films, and kind of the trashy action films, they kind of started dissipating. As everyone knows, horror was in a really bad place by the end of the decade. But yeah, of course, canon was pretty much on its last legs around that time too. So all the fun things like the Charles Bronson and Chuck Norris movies, for example, that was all going straight to VHS at that time, and that's where it stayed for quite a while.
Yeah, unfortunately, and it's hard in some respects to picture going to a modern Cineplex and seeing a movie like this, whereas back in the 80s it was something we just took for granted. And of course, one of the things that also changed too, of course, was this proliferation of the chains, and the chains have a certain degree of control over what's shown in theaters. And for example, it's impossible nowadays to show movies unrated, whereas as a 8-year-old kid, I was able to get in to see Day of the Dead,
Yes.
which I was probably much too young to see it. But anyway, because it was unrated, they couldn't really stop me. So I was able to see that movie on the big screen as an 8-year-old, and I was traumatized by it. But there you go. I mean, you can't do that nowadays because the chains have kind of a stranglehold over everything. So the little sort of mom and pop theaters, which aren't entirely gone, but for the most part aren't nearly as prevalent as they used to be. It kind of makes me nostalgic. Anytime seeing a movie like Vigilante, or really any of the major three Bill Lustig movies, Maniac, Vigilante, and Maniac Cop, makes me very nostalgic for a period of time where it wasn't necessarily that always films were better. There were lots of bad films made during this time, make no mistake about it, but it was just a great period in the sense that pretty much anything went, and this kind of excess and over the top and sleaziness and tackiness and everything was kind of, in a weird way, kind of warmly embraced by the American public for a period of time.
Yeah, that's the thing. Even the more compromised or lesser films of this ilk, they still had this kind of tangy flavor, which I think is why they've aged so well and people kind of treasure it now. It's, by the way, I know a lot of people seem to be confused by this ending because of the way that it's cut, but people seem to think that the judge is the one who's fingering the button for some reason. I'm not sure why they think that. If you look away for a second, you might be confused, but no, that's definitely not the judge doing that. It's Forster.
Yeah, they're not paying attention.
Yeah, they're really not. I mean, I know you don't actually see Forster, you don't pan down to Forster like pulling the button, but that's why they say, oh, why would the judge touch a red button in his car? It's like, no, it's Forster.
The judge had a pang of conscience and decided to blow himself up. Let's go with that.
Yeah. What's this weird thing in my car? Let me punch this button and see what happens. It's like, no.
Yeah, well, I know I always want to press the weird, mysterious red box button that shows up in my car.
Yeah, it's like Ren and Stimpy, like, don't touch the red button.
Yes, the Bride of Frankenstein laboratory with the lever that can blow everything to atoms. Why do you even have that? No, that's a disaster waiting to happen. No, I've always thought it was clear enough, but I guess it shouldn't surprise me. People don't tend to pay attention too much.
Maybe if you watch the Pan and Scan one, that's where the confusion started. I don't know. But,
that could be.
Yeah. Well, that's it for Vigilante. This is a fun one to revisit. I'm glad this is getting an upgrade once again. The sparkly 4K treatment. I think if Maniac deserves it, this one does too. I think they're both very worthy films from that same much missed era.
Oh, absolutely. And again, it's been a lot of fun talking about it. And obviously we strayed and went into a variety of different side pockets and avenues and digressions. But again, if you're looking for really specific material pertaining to the film and its production and so forth, you've got two commentary tracks with the people who actually directly involved. So you can listen to them as well. Obviously, I highly recommend that because there's a lot of interesting stories to be told about the making of this film. See Randy Jurgensen's name pop up a couple of times already here, for example. Again, very interesting character. But
absolutely. And since we're hearing it again, I just want to say again, thank you, Jay Chataway, for the score. Fingers crossed we'll get the soundtrack released. But again, a very unsung composer. I think he always did really solid work, and I think this is really him at his finest. I think this is one of my favorite main themes from this period, especially the early 80s. It's still just absolutely kicks, and I think with all the synthwave craze that's been going on the last few years, this one absolutely fits in. It's a soundtrack ripe for rediscovery, just like the film itself.
It's true. We're not privy to the final specs of everything they're including, but they've been doing all the soundtracks, so hopefully they'll be able to rescue this one. I know I'll be listening to it a lot if they actually include it.
Yeah, God willing. By the way, you saw the name Willie Colon, who's an actor in the film, but contractually they had to use 5 songs by him in the film, and so there was never an official soundtrack, but he did release an album called Vigilante, which was with Hector Lavoe, you saw as the singer there. But again, if you look at the cover, it actually uses the Vigilante font from the poster on top of a revolver with the pictures of the two men on it. So it's kind of a soundtrack, kind of not. So we got no Chataway score, but we did get those songs, even though you barely hear them in the film itself. So that's showbiz for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a lot of fun talking about this one. I'm hopeful that someday perhaps the movie gods will shine on William Lustig and give him an opportunity to make some more films. But with at least 3 gems to his credit, I think that's something to be proud of.
Well, thank you for letting me ride shotgun on this one, Troy. Again, much appreciated, and thank you, Blunderground, for bringing this one back out and giving a nice restoration that it so amply deserves.
Yes, indeed, and thank you for riding shotgun with me. This has been Troy Howarth and Nathaniel Thompson talking about Vigilante. I hope you've enjoyed listening.